Okay. You're still unmuted, sister. Okay. Okay. So we got a little abruptly and unceremoniously cut off from our study last night. So we'll try to jump right back in where we left off. Again, we were doing um, a review of some of the prophetic developments over the past 7 weeks or so since our last uh, 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 review, a mid-trumpet review in the Sixth Trumpet. And we were looking at especially those things that have been happening, at least some of those things that we can see in just the mainstream news about what's happening in our world and in our country related to what I believe is the blowing of the Sixth Trumpet. So, and again, there's so many things that we have to ultimately can look at. Just in this update that we're doing now, again, I have almost 500 different news articles that I have bookmarked and linked here. And we just barely got started looking at them last night. And we'll probably actually have to have another study after tonight to really get through them all. But when we got cut off from our connection last night, we were looking at this article here. So we're just looking really just at the headlines. There's just too many articles to look at the details of any of them or even to open them all in different tabs to try to kind of look at them, you know, which might even crash my computer here. So hopefully we can just see here all of the headlines. And the last one we looked at was here is the FBI readies a new war on trans people. And I think that was what we were talking about when we lost connection. So we were talking about how in the past few years leading up to the recent transition in our government administration, there was a tremendous push to the extreme left um, in in order to elicit the assured backlash and swing of the pendulum back towards the right, heading towards a union of church and state and a call for a return of morality in our society. And so while the atheistic secular mindset, secular humanist mindset was really pushed, and all of the LGBTQ issues and the social justice issues and all of the craziness around these trans people. Now, not only is there a backlash in mindset, but even the government structures are being used to try to create an attack on these issues. So the FBI is now uh, being marshaled, its resources, to try to get uh, these the treatment, the sort of favorable treatment towards trans people, and even the promotion that this is somehow normal and should be normalized in our society to be getting taken out of society, and especially, I think, among our schools and our young people. And it's an interesting development. Um, of course, in many ways, uh, uh, as Bible-believing Christians, we did not support the tenor of the way things were going in the secular humanistic mindset, and I don't think it's appropriate to be teaching young people that it's okay to choose to think that you're a different gender than you actually are. And yet, as we see the government being marshaled to attack such things or to weed such things out from our society, it also is something that we need to be watching because those same resources can later be in the future twisted to target people who are actually advocating and believing things that are right, such as following and believing what the scriptures say. Um, the next article was from the Wall Street Journal, and it talks about how the U.S. is planning a fresh $6 billion in new arms sales to the nation of Israel in the Middle East. Of course, Israel has been a longtime ally of the United States in that part of the world, and yet we know Satan has a false dispensational interpretation of prophecy uh, that is leading to a clash of civilizations between the so-called Judeo-Christian world and the Muslim and secular humanist world. Um, and uh, these and there's an increasing escalation of the war rhetoric of what's been going on. And of course, Israel itself has been at least on at a minimum, seven-front war in the Middle East for the past few years. Interesting number, seven. Um, and there's even been recently an eighth with the developments around Iran and these wars and rumors of wars that are escalating. The U.S. government and our tax dollars are very much being used to fund these developments. And I just thought I'd note that continues apace. And of course, in a special way, evangelical Christians, because of their acceptance of dispensationalism, have a sort of a tremendous, at least up until recently, for the past several decades, almost knee-jerk, absolute support for Israel, no matter what, because in their view, in order for end time events to come to pass and for Jesus to come, the nation of Israel has to be restored and has to continue to the end. And in their minds, the third temple has to be built and many other things have to happen. And this clash uh, of civilizations with Israel at the heart must come to pass in their minds in order for Jesus to come. So they're very much in favor of these developments. And Satan, of course, is working his control over the leaders of these nations in order to make it seem that his false interpretation of prophecy is indeed coming to pass. And but we'll also see there'll be another thread through these headlines that we'll be looking at, that there is a growing backlash against Israel and a growing increase in an anti-Semitic fervor, as it were. And we'll have to consider where that's tending and leading. And we'll look at some of those articles. Um, uh, I'll just note here that it was just interesting to me that here in the New York Times, supposedly the publication of record, or at least historically was thought of that way, it says the oldest dome-headed dinosaur revealed by a, quote, shockingly beautiful fossil. So they've been increasingly in modern times, and including in this article, they've been finding so-called fossils of dinosaurs in which they have very much have attributes such as still containing skin cells and bone marrow and other very um, tenuous, as it were, tissues that can't possibly survive for millions of years after death. And at a minimum, and only in certain environmental conditions, interestingly, such as a completely oxygen-free environment that might happen, say, by a catastrophic flood, um, remain intact for perhaps thousands of years, but certainly not millions of years. And so such findings very much contradict the mainstream view of millions and even billions of years of supposed history of this world, and much more confirm the timeline that the Bible gives us. And even a mainstream publication like the New York Times is sharing some of this information, even though they didn't present it in a way that I'm sure lifts up the scriptures, and yet it is evidence that actually supports the scriptures. And, we're told that God will reveal everything and expose all of the deceptions that are happened in this world before the end. There is nothing hidden that shall not be brought out. Here is an interesting article. Russia is seizing churches in France. So off the top of my head, remember all the details about this particular article. Um, but it's just interesting that there is um, the growing conflict of secularism versus sectarianism, so-called church belief, is increasing in our societies, especially here in Europe, which has been so secular for so long. Here is a article from the Express in the United Kingdom. We've noted before in some of our previous updates how, especially the publications coming out of the United Kingdom, are very much pushing the conflict with Russia and seeking to put out propaganda that is constantly escalating the situation and trying to put out the mindset that we're very much heading into World War III imminently. And of course, in some ways, that might be partially true, but it's also, it seems to be the case that they almost seem like they want it to happen. And the rhetoric that is often seen from these publications, especially in the UK, seems to repeatedly be pushing this line of thinking into the mindset of people. And again, with all these articles, I noted last night that we're not taking sides on what we believe about what these articles say and their substance. We're just trying to look at what mindset is being cultivated through the propaganda that's coming in the mainstream media that people are consuming every day. So here's an article that there is a defector, so-called defector from the Kremlin in Russia, that says Putin's, quote, gray zone invasion plan to start World War III before Christmas this year. So not only are they suggesting that World War III is imminent, but they're suggesting that there's actually plans for it to start by Christmas, which of course is barely more than a month away at this point. Uh, Here is another article from the Express, which is also in the UK. Uh, uh, same publication, actually. And Russia recruits 20,000 Cubans to fight against Ukraine as, quote, casualties soar. Now, I think all of the information, whether coming from the Western side and the NATO countries, or whether coming from Russia, um, targeted at the Western audience, we often need to take it with a grain of salt. There's a tremendous amount of government-sponsored propaganda on both sides that is seeking to massage people's views of what's happening in this war. And I don't know if we can truly understand exactly what's happening on the ground, but a mindset is trying to be pushed from the NATO side that Russia is really struggling and having difficulties, and that in this case they're having to bring in soldiers, 20,000 soldiers from Cuba, in order to continue their conflict with Ukraine. I personally don't think that's quite right as far as what's really happening on the ground in Ukraine, but it's interesting that that is what's being promoted here and that mindset. Um, Here is another article from the Metro in the UK. Germany's darkest days resurface after shop bans Jews from entering. So, again, especially because of Israel's conflicts in the Middle East, and most especially because of the conflict over Gaza, where tremendous atrocities have been happening, there is a growing backlash in many countries in the world, and including Western nations, uh, uh, to again uh, view Jewish people in a very unfavorable light. And I think Satan, again, is manipulating this situation that, that we know historically what happened in World War II with the Jewish nation and the Jews um, in Europe in particular, and how that was sort of a beta testing practice for what they're planning in this final crisis. And again, we've also discussed the idea that by ultimately placing Jewish people in a prominent light and then ultimately twisting the situation to make it appear, whether it's true or valid or not, that they are in an unfavorable light, that will be ultimately used to promote anti-Sabbath sentiment. Satan, of course, we know, hates God's true seventh-day Sabbath. And one of the ways that I believe that Satan is going to try to attack the Sabbath in the end is actually by attacking Jews. And that way, he can attack the Sabbath without drawing attention to the truth as taught by Seventh-day Adventists about the Seventh-day Sabbath still being valid today for Christians and not just for Jews. And of course, even the whole idea that it's, quote, the, quote, Jewish Sabbath is also itself a line of propaganda and deception, because we know the Sabbath was made for man, and that goes all the way back to the creation in the beginning, long before there was a Jew. Here's an article from Time magazine in the US. Pentagon accused of, quote, intimidation with media restrictions. So the Pentagon, that's the Defense Department headquarters here in America, are now called the Department of War. Very interesting propaganda change here in America. Again, from the founding of our country, it was actually, that department was actually known as the War Department or the Department of War, all the way through World War II. And then it got changed to the Department of Defense after World War II. And now President Trump has promoted the idea of, again, referring to it as the Department of War, which, of course, also sends the psychological message that we're preparing for war. And in particular, that we're preparing for World War III, since the last time it was called that was in World War II. And as part of that, the Pentagon, under the Secretary of War, as it were, Pete Hegseth, has had a very concerning tendency to want to limit media access and information that's coming out of the Pentagon, that we have less and less insight to what's really going on in this world. And of course, the military has much more influence on our country than most Americans recognize or acknowledge. And both through the military and through the intelligence agencies, our government has actually truly been hijacked and is not really operating under the constitutional principles upon which we were founded anymore. Here, again, from the New York Times, we have an article that Trump's Justice Department closed investigation into Tom Homan for accepting bag of cash. So Tom Homan is one of the, I believe, the head of Customs and Border Protection, and is one of the ones leading out these so-called ICE raids, the Immigrations and Customs Enforcement Agency, where literally bands of armed men in masks have been authorized to go around America and simply round people up for on nearly any pretext. Um, it's allegedly targeting people who have entered our country illegally, but we've seen that many people who are actually citizens are also being swept up in these raids and are being taken away to designated camps that are being set up all around our country, essentially concentration camps. And many people are being denied their constitutional rights, even if they're U.S. citizens. They're not being even given an opportunity to prove that they're citizens, and they're often being held in very disconcerting circumstances, whether they're citizens or not. Um, and the one of the people who is the head of this agency, Tom Homan, who has been a strong supporter of President Trump and of restricting immigration into the United States, whether legal or illegal, was caught accepting a bag of $50,000 in cash. And he was investigated for this, and the Justice Department just simply closed the investigation without doing anything about it. And these are the types of people that are in charge of these these armed groups who are rounding up people around our country. And of course, we know ultimately all of these resources that they're and the logistical structures that are being set up supposedly to target illegal immigration, and maybe in some ways it is being used to target illegal immigration, at least at some level. Yet ultimately, these things are going to be turned against other groups and ultimately, especially against Bible-believing Christians in the end. And the structures and the logistics and the funding to support it and the psychological operations to get people to accept allowing that to happen are going forth apace in our country right now. And again, we talked about in I think our last update how the funding bill, the so-called Big Beautiful Bill that was passed over the summer, included ultimately $175 billion, that's billion with a B, in funding for customs and border protection. And I think somewhere around maybe 70 billion of that was specifically for these so-called ICE raids. Um, this level of funding is equivalent to how much Russia spends on its entire military budget for an entire year while it's fighting a full-blown conflict with Ukraine right now. Um, and that level of funding is now being completely has been funded and is being paid out to establish these structures to be able to round up people at gunpoint in America without question and without the right to due process. Here's an article about Gavin Newsom, who's the governor of California and a likely leading presidential candidate in 2028 for the Democratic side. Gavin Newsom referred for a Secret Service, quote, threat assessment after an X post. So I don't exactly remember the details of the X post off the top of my head here, but Gavin Newsom posted some type of message on X, or which is formerly Twitter, and critical of President Trump and his administration, and as a potential opposing candidate on the other political side, he's actually been referred to the Secret Service for a quote threat assessment. So now the government structures are being directly used to target political enemies. And of course, that's not necessarily something new. I think the same thing happened under previous presidents, such as President Biden, against, in some sense, and other Democratic administrations as well, President Obama, against Republicans and conservatives. and yet the way it's being done and the scale that it's being done and the brazenness with which it's being done is escalating dramatically. Um, Here is another article from the Hill, a political publication here in America. Armed man detained outside the Arizona stadium hosting Charlie Kirk Memorial. So we talked a little bit in both our previous update and last night about the assassination of Charlie Kirk and all of the follow-on developments and how it's being used and manipulated, and the seemingly whether true or false Christian, so-called Christian revival that's happening in response to it, and also um, uh, because the alleged killer of Charlie Kirk, whether he was truly the killer or not, was supposedly in a relationship, a homosexual relationship with a trans person. Um, that's part of the psychological operations that are being used to target the secular humanists in our society. And also, there is a tremendous amount of people who are getting very angry and advocating violence on both sides, even very much publicly. And we saw how people were actually had celebrated Charlie Kirk's brutal public assassination and murder, and how other people are on the conservative side are increasingly in favor of violence to put down people that have such a mindset. And there was some armed man, whoever he may be, supposedly, who tried to come and enter into the stadium where this memorial was happening. Here, another article. Larry Ellison, he was the founder of Oracle, one of the largest tech companies in the world. And it says, the billionaire Blair ally shifting the world's media to the right. So Larry Ellison has traditionally been someone, unlike a lot of these tech billionaires like Jeff Bezos from Amazon or Elon Musk from Tesla and SpaceX and Twitter. Larry Ellison has generally been someone who's been more of a behind-the-scenes guy who didn't really have much of a public face. And yet now he's very much seemed to be stepping out into the front much more, and he is been buying up huge media assets, major media companies, and trying to put together a huge media conglomerate in support of the so-called right conservative wing. And of course, inspiration tells us that a few rich men would seek to grasp control of the lines of business in certain key industries as we come closer and closer to the end. And this is certainly along the lines of fulfilling that statement made over 100 years ago by Sister White. It's indeed coming to pass. Um, Here is another article from a publication called The Bulwark. I'm not quite familiar with, but it's about Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who is the Health and Human Secretary, Human Services Secretary under the Trump administration, who in many ways has been promoting many things that we can probably generally support, that about many of the things that have been going on in our society that promote very negative health outcomes for us, and the poisoning of our food supply and of our air and of our water. And he is wanting to do something about that and try to, quote, make America healthy again. And the big food and agriculture and pharmaceutical companies are very displeased with his efforts. And there's a constant media effort to try to undermine and discredit the work that he's doing. And this is an article of that tenor. And they are not giving up easily and going quietly into the night, as it were. Um, Here is an article from the Atlantic um, publication that the U.S. is quietly pausing some arms sales to Europe. So, of course, we know that President Trump has, at least until very recently, has been very highly critical of the Russia-Ukraine war and our sort of unquestioning support for Ukraine in that war. And as part of that effort, it seems behind the scenes, we are putting a pause or at least slowing down some of the traditional arms sales through NATO to European countries, which is an interesting development. Um, Here is an article from Mediate or Mediaite publication. And crowd roars as Erica Kirk, quote, forgives suspected killer. So at the memorial for Charlie Kirk that happened back in September, just within 2 weeks after his public assassination, his widow, Erica Kirk, um, publicly forgave the suspected killer or the alleged killer, which was a very interesting development, a seemingly very, quote, Christian thing to do, though many other things that Erica Kirk has been doing have been a little bit questionable in my eyes. None of us know her heart or what's really going on behind the scenes, but I think that was a very interesting thing that happened, and it received quite a lot of public press, and many people were incredibly shocked that she was willing to do this. So God can use all things to bring glory to his name and to his character. Here is an article from the Metro in the UK again about the Russia-Ukraine war. And here, Germany prepares to treat, quote, 1,000 injured soldiers a day in a war with Russia. So many of the countries in Europe, especially those that border Russia or are very close to bordering Russia and Ukraine, have been making dramatic preparations for war. And here, this article is one of those telling us that they're literally making plans to have to treat 1,000 injured soldiers a day, German soldiers, as it were. Now, there are no soldiers from European countries supposedly on the ground yet in Ukraine, and yet here are efforts being undertaken to prepare the hospital system and the health system in Germany to be treating mass casualties of German soldiers, as if they're very much expecting to be at war with Russia very soon. Uh, Here from the Mirror in the UK, Poland's Donald Tusk, that's the president of Poland, warns country will shoot any Russian planes in its airspace. So there's been allegations that Russian warplanes have been making violations of airspace of NATO countries, whether that's true or not. Um, and now here publicly, Poland is saying that they intend to shoot down any such planes. And such developments, of course, any such developments can very quickly escalate into actual war. Here is another article from MSN.com. Predator drones shift from border patrol to protest surveillance. So predator drones are those are very sophisticated, rather large drones that are typically used in war theater overseas against known so-called enemies. And in recent years, they have been shifted to doing surveillance along the border connected to the immigration crisis And now, even most recently, according to this article, they're actually now being shifted to surveilling Americans on American soil who simply are protesting things against the government which they are unhappy, which is certainly a concerning development. That, and of course, predator drones not only have incredibly sophisticated surveillance technology on them, they also, of course, can be armed with very sophisticated weapons. Here from the Wall Street Journal, Black Swan manager sees huge rally, then 1929 style crash. A black swan is the idea that there are unforeseen uh, possibilities that cannot truly be planned for. There are some things that aren't fully understood, but that efforts that can be made to make uh, um, reasonable accommodations and plans for things that can be reasonably foreseen to possibly happen. But a black swan event is actually one that no effort to plan for can ultimately foresee what's going to come. And it's actually related to the idea that for hundreds of years, it was believed that there were only white swans in the world and there was no such thing as a black swan. And then eventually it was discovered that there actually are black swans. So it's this idea that there are things, the unknown unknown, as it's called. And here is a money manager who sort of tries to specialize in this type of investment climate, who believes that there's going to be an increasing rally, a huge rally, sort of peaking in a bubble very soon in the Western markets, and then it's going to lead to a 1929 style crash, such as the led to the Great Depression back in those days. Interesting that we're very rapidly approaching the 100-year anniversary of that crash. And of course, again, we've been talking about prophetically how we should be expecting a great economic crash to come, where uh, uh, the rich men and the mighty men of Babylon will bewail the fall of Babylon. Here is another article about how black Christians are confronting Charlie Kirk's religious legacy. There's allegations that Charlie Kirk somehow was uh, um, racially biased against black people. I think the kind of quotes that they take to try to justify that are really taken out of context, at least from the ones that I've seen. Um, but this idea of promoting racial tension is being put out there in the press. Here's an article from the Wall Street Journal that why marriage is increasingly just for the affluent. A strange idea that I've never heard until recently. Of course, marriage God created for all human beings. It's his natural way, but how it's increasingly difficult, and that there are many aspects of our society that are constantly being put in the way to create obstacles to maintaining healthy marriages, and that if, especially if you're poor or powerless, that this is becoming harder and harder. And one wonders what the motivation is for that, and also if there might be a great backlash against that in support of, quote, promoting Christianity in our society. Here's an article from the Jerusalem Post. Russia and Iran signed nuclear power deal this week. So as America becomes, and the Western countries are often increasingly closer with Israel, Russia is growing closer and closer in its alliance with Iran. which of course is part of the false dispensationalist view of prophecy, especially Ezekiel 38 and 39, where supposedly an alliance of, of Israel and America and the certain Western democracies on one side will come into conflict with Russia and Turkey and Iran in particular, and the Muslim nations on the other side as a part of a so-called World War III that leads to an apocalyptic scenario. And in particular, also interesting that it involves nuclear power, which would, of course, help to enable Iran's so-called nuclear weapons program, or at least alleged nuclear weapons program. Here in the Express in the UK, Copenhagen and Oslo airports shut down after a large drone incident. So there have been, there's probably several articles here in this about that have been increasingly reported in the press about very large, major drones that are appearing over both airports and military installations and other targets of significance in Western countries, and particularly in Europe, but also even in America. There, and of course, these incidents are at least being blamed in the press on Russia, whether that's actually what's happening or not. And again, it's promoting the idea of escalation of conflict with Russia, which is the most, at least likely seemingly scenario that could lead to what we would describe as, quote, World War III. Here from the Daily Mail in the United Kingdom, what happened when hundreds of Americans were handed free cash to do nothing? A controversial guaranteed income experiment. So, over the past decade or so, there have been multiple kind of beta testing experiments in various locales where there are these been these efforts and programs where people are simply given a guaranteed basic income, where they are given a certain amount of money or cash or a debit card or whatever have you, what they can use for whatever they want, as opposed to specific welfare programs targeted to specific needs, such as health care or food or like a SNAP program or whatever have you. That instead, that the idea that perhaps we'd all be better off and it might lead to better social cohesiveness if everybody just receives some amount of basic income. And they've been sort of testing out how to do this and what the consequences of doing this are. And this article talks a little bit about that. And I think that's actually part of the final deception about no buy, no sell, uh, that as we get closer to the final crisis, um, that not only will you be cut off from the financial system and not be able to buy or sell if you do not go along with the promotion of Sunday sacredness, but if you do go along with it, that you will be given a handout of a certain amount of money. And quite possibly all of your debts would also be forgiven as well, which of course would be a great inducement to go along with the system. And they seem to be making active plans through these test programs. Here from MSN.com, Trump's nuclear, quote, renaissance rests on risky plan for radioactive waste. So President Trump has been promoting both a renaissance of both nuclear power generation in America and also of the development of modernized nuclear weapons. And as that happens, there will have to be an increasing production of radioactive waste, and something needs to be done with it. And all of the ways that they've attempted to deal with that radioactive waste have created many problems. And this article discusses some of those consequences. Here from Axios, Pentagon restricts speaking engagements alongside media crackdown. So again, this goes back to the earlier article that we mentioned that there is this increasingly tight control of information, both coming out of the military Pentagon and also about what's happening in the Pentagon as these war preparations proceed apace. And really, all parties, whether it's America or the NATO nations in Europe or Russia or China or Iran and some countries in the Middle East, it seems that nearly all the nations of the earth are, are actively engaging in what traditionally would have been considered war preparations. So everybody seems to think that war is coming soon. And as part of that, media information about what's happening is being very tightly controlled. Here from NBC News, more Americans are living in RVs as housing costs rise. So speaking about the economic challenges for the vast majority of people in America, as our government continues to spend money by the trillions and devalues the value of our savings and increasingly is gobbling up more and more of a larger percentage of our resources to go to support its military industrial complex. And one of the ways that people are responding is by choosing to live in tiny homes and RVs. And it's just an interesting story that seems to fit in with some of the things that we've been looking at. Here from the Daily Mail in the UK, all the, quote, biblical signs pointing to the rapture coming, quote, tomorrow, as believers spread fears, the end is nigh. So this was back in October, where a certain prominent evangelical preacher claimed that set a date for the rapture, which of course came and went, because the rapture is not a true biblical doctrine. But it got quite a bit of press, and quite a lot of people were very concerned about it. And it shows how a false understanding of Scripture and doctrine can lead to fanaticism. Here from the New York Post, Secret Service foils plot to cripple New York City cell network, threaten UN General Assembly. So Secret Service supposedly discovered this plot to target the cell network in New York, and during the time that the UN General Assembly was meeting at the end of September. It was very interesting that there were, I believe it was like tens of thousands of SIM cards that were all, and what have you, servers that they discovered in a location in New York that were designed to be able to do certain electronic attacks on our, our communications networks. Interesting, and not a lot of information about supposedly who was behind this. It was a sophisticated enough operation that it was something that really would have to be attributed to a nation state and not to just some random actors. And who that might be and why that happened is very interesting. Here's another article from NBC News about the same story. Here's an article from the Washington Post. Toxins, tech, and tumors. Is modern life fueling the rise of cancer in millennials? So there's a tremendous increase in cancer, and especially so-called turbo cancers, which are rapid onset cancers that are happening among young people who traditionally largely, almost very rarely receive cancer or a diagnosis of cancer. And It's interesting that they're connecting it to toxins in tech, which I believe is in some sense a contributing factor to cancer. But that's been going on for a long time, and as the the connection of toxins in tech to the rise in cancers has traditionally been something that has been um, the mainstream media has largely sought to discredit, and now suddenly they seem to be embracing the idea. And rather than simply acknowledging what may have some truth to it, I believe that even this acknowledgement is itself a deception, and that the likely increase in cancer that we've seen very recently among millennials is much more likely related to the COVID vaccines, but they don't ever want to acknowledge that. So now they're blaming something that we are more likely to accept as one of the contributing factors. Here from NBC News, in a major shift, Trump says that he now thinks Ukraine can win back all of its territory taken by Russia. So up until recently, Trump has really been pretty anti-Ukraine, not supportive of Ukraine in this conflict with Russia. He doesn't think he is up until recently been critical of anybody who has supported the idea of us backing Ukraine in that conflict and has sought to de-escalate the conflict, at least publicly, and of course promoted as part of his campaign last year for the presidency that he could end the war on day one of his presidency. And he seems to have become very frustrated with Putin, at least publicly, in the fact that he's not been successful in doing that. And I think at a minimum, as a negotiating tactic with Russia, he seems to have now flipped and is saying, seems to be, have made multiple statements in support of Ukraine in that conflict, which is an interesting development. Here's another article from the Mediaite publication on the same issue. Trump pulls a jaw-dropping 180 in shocking post mocking Russia. Um, Yet another article from The Sun in the UK on the same issue. Trump backs Ukraine to take all its land back and says his relationship with Putin didn't mean anything, quote, in a major shift. And at the same time as he did that, he gave a very prominent speech at the United Nations when it met at the end of September. And here from the US version of the Sun publication out of the UK says Trump goes scorched earth on, quote, failing UN in speech blasting immigration, world-ending nukes, and, quote, Sharia law in London. So whatever President Trump really thinks about any of these issues, he is a masterful manipulator of the media and of political propaganda and of agitating his enemies, or at least perceived political enemies. And this was quite an interesting speech that he gave at the United Nations. Here also, at the same time, about the same issue from MSN, Trump upbraids UN in speech claiming, quote, your countries are going to hell. Here from the Express in the UK, Trump reveals AI plan, that's an artificial intelligence plan, to control biological weapons after terrifying warning. So there is a number of articles that we could probably look at that have been increasingly appearing in the mainstream press about artificial intelligence on many issues, but especially on the concerning idea of militaries, both in the US and in NATO countries and in other countries like China and around the world and Russia, supposedly giving AI control over things like biological and chemical weapons or even nuclear weapons, of also of armed drones, where A human controller is being taken out of the equation and what that might lead to. Here from a publication called Lawfare Media, the Department of Homeland Security is unlawfully collecting DNA. So the Department of Homeland Security, which is supposedly designed to protect our country. Interestingly, that name, Homeland Security, actually comes from Nazi Germany. That also had a Department of Homeland Security or a Ministry of Homeland Security. Um, and increasingly, our government is collecting DNA of Americans and doing so actually in a way that's against the law. And one wonders what the purpose is. Um, Here from the apace English website, the Great Revolution Against Alzheimer's. It's the first time in human history that we've managed to slow the disease. So there's increasingly uh, boastful claims about advances in science, in attempts to fight certain debilitating diseases, including neurological diseases like Alzheimer's. I think their claims are greatly inflated, and it's constantly, at a minimum, putting out the mindset that human ingenuity and advancements in technology are the solution to our health problems, which of course itself is a deception. Here's an article from Wired magazine. Nick Fuentes' plan to conquer America. Nick Fuentes is a influencer and podcaster on the so-called far right conservative side of the political equation here in America, who is uh, seemingly becoming increasingly popular and who espouses very interesting and very inflammatory rhetoric, um, at least claimed by many to be white supremacist and racist and anti-Semitic. I don't know a lot about Nick Fuentes or listen to a lot about it, so I know many people who make such accusations about others sometimes do so in an exaggerated way, but it may be true of this man. I don't really know. He's actually quite a young man. I believe he's still in his 20s, but he's very influential and increasingly popular one way or the other. And it's his rhetoric certainly is being used in the media to sow division, the divide and conquer strategy. Here from the AP News, exploring the resurgence of foraging as more people look to reconnect with nature. So, sort of I think, a positive development. More people concerned about uh, food insecurity and about the contamination of the food supply. Many more people are seeking to get out in nature and learn how to forage wild edibles. And that's something that we can actually support. Here from MSN, CDC warns of surge in dangerous, highly antibiotic resistant bacteria. So, of course, the CDC is the Centers for Disease Control. Historically was considered one of our top public health institutions here in America. I personally question the the motivation and the effectiveness of this agency from its inception, but certainly since the time of the COVID crisis in the past 5 years, its credibility has been greatly undermined and diminished in the eyes of many. And now suddenly it's not necessarily suddenly, this is an increasingly modern idea for the past couple of decades, ultimately, but now it's pushing warnings that there's these dangerous, highly antibiotic resistant bacteria, which of course could be one of the basis for another major disease outbreak. And one wonders what the motivation is for this messaging in the public. Yeah, this is an interesting article from Newsweek that Joe Rogan, he's the number one podcaster in the nation and in the world, has tens of millions of followers, and was actually previously a comedian, interestingly enough. And he has these long format podcasts of 3 hours with some of the most prominent people in the world. And he recently issued a public warning to the followers of President Trump, the so-called MAGA movement, Make America Great Again, over the criticism and canceling of Jimmy Kimmel, the late night talk show host that we talked about last night. That he really saw, who of course is also another comedian, which might be one of the reasons why Joe Rogan thought to speak out about this issue, since he's generally seen as someone who supports President Trump, at least most recently in the past couple of years and through the most recent election. But he just found it to be somewhat absurd, like probably many of us do, that why is the president and the current administration spending so much time worried about late night talk show hosts making jokes? Um, whether they are funny jokes or whether they're appropriate jokes, um, they are the targeting of those in the media and those who are ultimately exercising their First Amendment right to free speech is something to be concerned about. And even Joe Rogan notices that this is something that we should be concerned about. Here's an article from the Telegraph in the UK. We're only got about 10 minutes left before we need to wrap up for the night. So we'll stop when we get close to that, and we'll pick it up in our next uh, 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 episode, as it were, our next meeting. But here, NVIDIA, $100 billion OpenAI sparks fears of an AI bubble is about to burst. So NVIDIA is the largest chip maker in the world, largely based in Taiwan. It actually recently became the first $5 trillion company, that's trillion with a T. And this article is speaking about how it made a $100 billion dollar investment in the OpenAI company that is promoting artificial intelligence in many ways and uses its technology, depends on NVIDIA's chips. And it was a very interesting article that all of these tech companies are often investing in each other in very large amounts. This is a $100 billion investment, and that's $100 billion with a B. And then those investments are actually recorded as revenue and income to the company, but then that company takes some of that revenue and invests it back in the other same companies. So it's sort of a circular investment where there's no actual true revenue being produced or true productive investment happening. And it's being used to prop up the value of the stocks of these companies, which are the biggest companies in the world and that represent really the largest share of the entire stock market. I think 7 tech companies today uh, uh, represent somewhere between somewhere over 70% of the entire S&P 500 stock market value is in just 7 tech companies that are using these techniques of just sending money back and forth between each other in so-called investments that are sort of self-serving and not actually producing anything. Uh, Here's an article um, from it's a poll from Quinnipiac College, one of the top Quinnipiac University, I guess it's now, pollsters in the country. Nearly 8 in 10 voters say the United States is in a political crisis. So many people, again, as inspiration tells us, many, nearly all, understand that we're somehow on the verge of a stupendous crisis, while they don't understand the spiritual and moral mechanisms that are really behind the crisis. But people understand that something great and stupendous is about to happen. Here is another article, America's Accelerating Exit from Itself. So even the mainstream media and even the secular humanists are recognizing that we are indeed increasingly abandoning every Protestant and Republican principle upon which our country was founded, even though many of these media uh, uh, companies and sites don't really recognize and understand the principles on which our country was founded. Yet they see that we're increasingly turning away from what America used to be. And then here, Pete Hegseth, the now Secretary of War, the Department of War, very interestingly and very concerningly, back in October, ordered a rare and urgent meeting of hundreds of generals and admirals. So every top four-star and above, I believe it was general and admiral in the entire U.S. military, I think it was over 800 generals and admirals in the U.S. military, were all required to come to an urgent meeting in person back at the Pentagon here in America, in what is truly, I think, unprecedented in my lifetime. I never heard of any such thing ever happening, and there's seemingly no reason to do it. Our military has secure communications where all these people could have met electronically, um, but they were pulled all out of their battlefield positions to come to this meeting, some of which was publicly aired, and actually President Trump spoke at that meeting, and it was very interesting. It ultimately talked about how he wanted to get all of the so-called DEI, the social justice uh, support for women and gays in the military, and getting, quote, fat people out from being in the military, and all kinds of strange things that were supposedly the purpose of this meeting. But there's absolutely no reason why they would all have to come in person in order for such a meeting to take place. And personally, I think that there was a non-public aspect of this meeting that we're not told about what was really happening. And it seems much more like planning for war in my mind, that they needed to all come in person for this meeting. It was a very concerning development. Um, all right, just about out of time. Here, another article that was from MSN. Here from The Sun in the UK. Denmark considers initiating NATO Article 4 after four airports are menaced by the mystery drones amid soaring World War III tensions. So again, this idea that these drones are increasingly appearing over airports and other important installations in Europe. And Article 4 of NATO is an article that calls for mandatory consultations among NATO members to discuss whether there's a need to invoke Article 5, which is the shared joint defense of all NATO nations. If you attack one NATO nation, then you've supposedly attacked them all, and all NATO nations are to come to the defense of any nation that is supposedly attacked. And so it's one step away from from that sort of so-called nuclear option of NATO. Here we saw this a similar article last night, I believe. Every adult in the UK will soon be required to have a digital, quote, brick card ID. That's from the Metro in the UK. This idea of increasingly pushing us into the digital sphere where we can be more readily surveilled and tracked, and where our economic ability to buy and sell can be flipped off at a digital switch. And people are being pushed into being absolutely required to join that system or else be shut out from the economic system and being able to buy or sell. And then maybe our last one we'll look at here for tonight from the publication The Times. Regulating AI hastens, quote, the Antichrist, says Palantir's Peter Thiel. So Peter Thiel is one of the original founders of PayPal. He's a billionaire. He's among the so-called PayPal mafia, as they call them, the key people that were behind the founding of PayPal, which is the one of the key companies that initially started this transition to digital payment systems, which is moving us towards this mark of the beast crisis. And he also has subsequently founded a company called Palantir, which actually comes from the so-called Palantir orbs or stones from the Lord of the Rings series that gave you insight into the future and also ability to see what no one else could see. And this is one of the companies that is actually being used to outsource from the U.S. government an ability to track every single human being on Earth and to surveil every single thing that you do. The U.S. government actually, soon after 9/11, announced a program called Total Information Awareness, where they were planning, in order to, quote, fight terrorism, to create a digital file on every single person in the world. And it received such criticism and backlash that this was being done by the government that they took basically that entire program and then outsourced it to a private company through Peter Thiel to create this company called Palantir. And strangely, this tech billionaire has been going about giving talks on the coming Antichrist. And he has very strange ideas about the Antichrist, including somehow that artificial intelligence is bringing in that trying to stop or regulate artificial intelligence will actually bring in the Antichrist, which is, among other things, incredibly self-serving based on what his company actually does and stands for. Okay, I think that's about as much as we can do tonight. We are running out of time, but we will pick it up in our next study. Why don't we wrap up with prayer? Heavenly Father, our most holy Creator God, we thank you that you are revealing these things to us. We can see just from what we've already looked at, and there's much more to go through, that there are incredibly disturbing developments on practically every level and every aspect of society, all of which are pointing to those final events and the final crisis of which we have been prophetically pointing to for more than 100 years, and that these things are clearly right upon us. Help our hearts to be right with you. Help us to surrender all to you. Help us to not be fearful, but that may these things lead us to trust you more and to grow closer to you and draw closer to you, that we might be your witnesses as these things come to pass. Thank you so much for loving us, and keep and preserve us until we can meet again as our prayer. May it be in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Amen.
All right.
Brother Craig, thank you for contributing to our preparation. Thank you. Good night.
Praise God. Good night. We'll pick it up again soon.
Good night. God bless.